This video is a high-level introduction to inventory management with Brightpearl. There are separate videos that cover each of the topics in detail, but this will give you a great overview. So first of all, let's cover some basic principles. Inventory levels can never go below zero. All inventory needs a cost price, which gives your asset value, and this goes through to your profit and loss report as cost of sales. And the current inventory level is the sum of your in transactions and your out transactions. Effectively, it's a double entry system, and each of your inbound and outbound transactions are given a date, and this allows retrospective inventory level reporting, which means you can query what your stock levels were at the end of last month, say. You can see these on the stock audit trail. So if we've had 24 come in and 6 go out, we've got 18 left in stock. Now, inventory management is very, very closely tied to accounting, because every time you change a stock level, it changes your asset value, and therefore an accounting entry has to be made as well. And this is why cost prices need to be accurate. And without accurate cost prices, your accounting reports are unlikely to be correct. If you don't want to manage your system this accurately, in other words, turn the cost of sales accounting off, you can do so. So there are 3 different numbers when we're talking about stock or inventory. The first is in stock, which is what you actually physically have on the shelf or in the warehouse. Now, out of those, you could have allocated some, so perhaps sales have come in from your e-commerce channels. These are reserved or allocated. And the leftover, effectively what you have left to sell, is your stock on hand. So with this example here, we've got 10 on hand, which is calculated from 12 in stock, less 2 which have been allocated to certain sales orders. And it's the on-hand level that we use when we integrate with sales channels such as eBay or your e-commerce store. So this allocation concept is pretty important. There are 2 ways to allocate stock. One is by directly allocating it to a sales order, and the second is by the existence of a goods out note, and that's a shipment. So if you create a shipment for a sale, any goods on that shipment are automatically allocated to that sale, which means you can't sell them to anybody else. And there's a separate video that explains all about allocation. It's important to note that you can't allocate inventory you don't have in stock. So, ways to add inventory to the system. One is to create a purchase order and then receive the goods on that, and that's the best way to receive goods in, because it means that when you later receive the purchase invoice from the supplier, you can reconcile the two. Another way to add inventory to your system is via a sales credit, so that's when customers are sending goods back to you. Another way is to receive a stock transfer or an inventory transfer between 2 different warehouses, and then finally you can add inventory using a stock correction. Ways to remove inventory include shipping a goods out note, and sometimes we call that a shipment. We can also remove stock by making a stock correction, and a stock correction does not affect the original purchase order or goods in. If you receive a purchase order and decide that you didn't want to do that, you can delete that entire purchase order batch, i.e. the whole goods in you can just delete in one go, as long as none of those items have already been sold. And then the final way to remove inventory is to make a purchase order correction. And this is different from a stock correction, in that a purchase order correction will affect the original purchase order, which means you can re-receive the inventory on that purchase order, or go and decrease the quantity on that purchase order, perhaps before you receive the purchase invoice. And there's only one way to actually modify your existing inventory, and that is to change the value, in other words the cost price, of any inventory you already have. And changing the cost price of your existing inventory creates accounting transactions, because again, the asset value has changed and therefore you've made a profit or a loss. Now let's have a look at warehouses. And warehouses represent separate physical locations of inventory. These could be separate buildings or perhaps within a building. And you can use warehouses within Brightpearl to represent perhaps a separate section within your warehouse that's used for damaged stock or stock that's being repaired. To move inventory between warehouses, you need to create what's called a transfer note, which is very similar to a goods out note. You then pick, pack and ship it, just like a standard shipment, and then receive it at the other end. So there's a little bit of work involved in moving items between warehouses, and bear that in mind when you set up new warehouses. Don't create too many. Once a warehouse has had inventory move through it, it cannot be deleted. All inventory reports can be filtered by warehouse, and it's also worth mentioning that orders are assigned to just one warehouse. You can, however, fulfill a sales order from multiple warehouses, so different lines come from different stock in different warehouses, and that's called partial fulfillment, which is covered in a separate video. Warehouse locations live within warehouses, and each warehouse has got its own set of locations. Locations are given by aisle, bay, shelf and bin, but you could use any 4 pieces of data, perhaps upstairs, downstairs, left, right and so on, and you don't have to use them all, so you could just have aisle and bay if you wanted, or aisle, bay and shelf. So products have a default location, and the default location can depend on the warehouse. So in warehouse A it might be in position 1, but in warehouse B the same product might be in position 4. Now there are 3 levels of location management, and this concept is covered in detail in a separate video. None, which means you don't track the location of items within a warehouse, but you can still have multiple warehouses. The standard location management, which means an item is always going to live in its default location. And then multi-concurrent location management, which means that every single goods in cycle for a product can be placed into a different location within the warehouse, which means that a product could well be spread across multiple locations. And finally, maintaining accurate stock levels is not just about the software you use. It's all about making sure that your team understand the processes, and those processes are rigidly and strictly adhered to, and you continue to make sure that's the case by running spot checks. So that takes us to the end of the introduction to inventory management with Brightpearl.